All right, let's do this. I'm going to give a couple of minutes just for folks to get in now that the stream is live. And then I'll kind of explain and walk you through what I'm going to be doing today. I'm sure you guys will have a lot of questions. I will try to get to those as best I can. But I mainly want to kind of stick to a particular agenda that I've got as far as wanting to show you some real basic things about how to get started with researching your family tree. I'm going to be using my own grandmother. This is my maternal grandmother, who is still living. And you guys have probably often heard me talk about her. She's dealing with Parkinson's and dementia, and she lives in a nursing facility. But she is still with us. But I thought I would use her because she has a pretty fascinating tree because she has a little bit of everything that I want to be able to show you today. And I'm starting as though I were starting from scratch to show you how I would find the people in her family tree. And hello, everybody. So the only thing I ask, and I put this in a pinned comment, is I ask that you keep any questions for me on topic. So, like, don't ask me what I think of some World War II general because we're talking about family history today. We'll do another meme stream real soon. You can ask me whatever questions you want. So I'm using Ancestry.com, and the reason that I'm using that to show you most of this today is that I find that of the multiple resources that I use for researching family tree, and there are a lot of different ones that I have memberships to, Ancestry seems to be the most user-friendly for somebody who's new starting out. There are other resources that are free, but are much more difficult to use until you know what you're doing a little bit. So thank you, John. I appreciate that. Emil, what I'm doing is I'm using my family to show you how to do your own research. Show you kind of the tips and the strategies and the tools to use for that. And you can see I've got a number of websites open up that I'll show you on here. But so let me just tell you a little bit about my grandmother. And so I'm gonna come at this as though I was somebody new starting their family tree, only with the little bit of information that they're aware of, and then I'll show you how to take that and discover more through the records. So my grandmother was born, I know this because she's alive, and so I could ask her this information when I started researching. I know she was born February 7th, 1943. She was born in a hospital in Youngstown, Ohio, though she grew up in Mineral Ridge, which is my hometown. I know her father's name was Thomas. I actually knew Thomas. He was 88 years old when he died. I was 5 years old, my great-grandfather. Now, you'll notice something right off the bat that's pretty interesting about my grandma's family, and that is when her parents were born. My grandma was born in 1943. She was the youngest of 7 children. Her oldest brother was born 28 years before she was. The 7 kids were really spread out. And so by the time my grandmother was born, her dad was almost 49 years old. And her mother was 46 years old, or almost 46 years old. She was 45. So they're right at the end of when they're able to have children. Devilizer himself, a lot of these resources will work internationally because, like Ancestry, for example, has a ton of UK resources. I'll show you some of those because my grandma's great-grandfather was born in the West Midlands in England. So Ancestry is a pay service, but there are some free ones that I'm going to show you in a little bit. But I'm using Ancestry only because it's very user-friendly and it's a good place to start. So I know, and here's what I entered in. So I knew my great-grandfather was 88 when he died. I knew I was 5 years old when he died. Okay, I was born in 1977, which means that he died probably in 1982. So I put that into the tree, that he died in 1982 in Ohio. That's all I've put in so far. Knowing that he was 88, I put in that he was born around 1894. I put that as about 1894, again, in Ohio, as though I don't know anything else. I know that my grandma's mother's maiden name, and you always want to use maiden names for the women because that's how you're going to find them, is based on what name they were born with. Her name was Mildred Olive Chambers, and she died when she was around 70. She had pancreatic cancer, and I know she was around 70 because my grandma remembered that. So again, and she was born at a place called York, Ohio, which is down near Steubenville. Now, again, I know a lot more than this, but I'm only telling you this to show, just to show how to research it. Yes, this will, all streams that I do stay up on the channel later, so they'll be available. So yeah, this will be up later if you can't stay for the whole thing and you want to be able to watch. So let's start with my grandma's dad. So here's what we know about him. Now you can see the hints. Now I want to warn you something about Ancestry Hints. Take them with a grain of salt, because your person might match someone else. Like for example, my Thomas has an uncle named Thomas that was born in the same town 3 years later. Yes, he's older than his uncle. And so it'd be easy to confuse the two guys. So the hints are a dangerous thing. But here's what I'm going to do. I know his wife was Mildred. I know they had kids in the 1920s and 1930s. So I'm going to start with the census. Thank you. Yeah, I'm still dressed from church. I'm going to start with the census. The United States Census is taken every 10 years, starting in 1790 and all the way up through the present day. Now, they release census records 72 years after the census. So next year, the 1950 census will be released for research. So right now, the newest one we have is 1940. In the UK, they also did a census every 10 years, but it was on the 1 year. So it was like 1911, 1921, 1931, etc. And I believe in the UK, 1911 might be the earliest one. Divide by zero. Thank you for that. So 3/4 of my family's from the Appalachians, 3 of my 4 grandparents. This is my one grandparent who doesn't have roots in Eastern Kentucky. So what if they're East Asian? Yeah, that's a completely different story. Doesn't necessarily work for that. So I'm going to go to the 1940 census. Here's Wethersfield Township. That's where Mineral Ridge is, which is where my grandma grew up. So I'm thinking, okay, my grandma grew up in Mineral Ridge. Here's a Thomas Whitaker in the 1940 census. This is probably my guy. And I can highlight over it and see that it says Lincoln Avenue. My grandma grew up on Lincoln Avenue. I know that. It was right across the street from the house I grew up in. So I know this is her family. So I'm going to click on the 1940 census. I know this is my great-grandfather. And I'm going to take a look at this. So right here is the 1940 census. And you've got Thomas and Mildred O. Whitaker, which I know was my great-grandparents' name. So this is their family. So now you can see all the information I can get from this 1940 census. Mineral Ridge, Trumbull County, Ohio. They live on Lincoln Avenue. You can see that right here. Right here is the value of their home, which in 1940 is $3,000, which is pretty good, especially right at the end of the Great Depression. I can see he's the head of household. He's listed as. Mildred is listed as his wife. Now, this is actually, and you're going to find a lot of mistakes like this, my Uncle Ralph is listed as head as well because he and his wife are living with them. But then Georgetta and Donald are actually my grandma's brother and sister. I knew both of them. In fact, Donald's still alive, my Uncle Don. So I know this is the right family. This tells me what state they were all born in. So Thomas and Mildred are born in Ohio. Ralph, my grandma's brother, is born in Ohio. His wife, Virginia, is born in West Virginia. And then his kids, Georgetta and Donald, are born in Ohio. This tells me where they were living in 1935, 5 years earlier. It says they were in the same house. And you can see all of this in the heading here. So here, and you can see they're real helpful with showing you this, so it kind of lines up. So Invincible, they release it 72 years later because of privacy issues. So they don't want people having access to the 2000 census, for example, because it would give you a lot of information about people who are very much alive, whereas most of the people who are listed as heads of household in the 1940 census, for example, are going to be gone by now. So now this tells me here, is he at private work? No. At public work? No. Seeking work? Yes. So that tells me that right now he's actually out of work. He's been laid off, and this is part of the Depression. He was a steel worker. Steel mills were a huge thing. The Youngstown area was one of the primary steel producers in the country at this time. He's been out of work at this point for 4 weeks. So that tells me all of this information about this. How common are skeletons in the closet? Very, very common. I'll tell you about an example from my wife's family in a little bit. Carlos, yeah, there's a little bit of Southern accent you'll pick up every so often from me, and I lived in Southern Indiana for a year, and it came out big time. So his most recent occupation was that he was a rougher in a sheet mill, a steel mill. They were making sheet metal. You can see worker class is PW, which means private work. And then these codes are just things that were used by the census. He worked at that job for 90 weeks. He didn't work that many in 1939. I think that's probably 40. His income, this tells me how much he was making per year. $1,777 was his income. Now, you might think that doesn't sound like a lot, but look at the other people on his street, what they're making. $270, $1,300, $360, $1,344. He was one of the highest paid people in his neighborhood. You got one right here that was Harry Knight, who made $23.40, but everybody else in the immediate vicinity to my great-grandfather made less than him. And that's actually something I knew from talking to my grandparents, because my grandpa, whose family was from eastern Kentucky, his dad was a brickmaker. They were much more lower class, and my grandma's family actually didn't like her dating my grandpa because they were kind of middle class, and my grandpa was very poor. Coming from Kentucky, and so there was a big discrepancy in terms of the social classes that they were in. So yeah, my great grandfather was doing really well, but I've been told that even then, they mostly during that time were just paying the interest on their mortgage to be able to pay for their house. So this tells me that I've got the right people, and it tells me he's 46 and she's 42 in 1940, which is right about what they were, and I know that's right. So I'm going to look for something a little different here. Here's the 1900 census. So now my great-grandfather is going to be a 5-year-old kid. So this is what this is going to tell me are the names of my great-grandfather's parents, which let's say I don't have that yet. So now we're going to take a look, and this is Niles, which is right next to Mineral Ridge. It's just a couple of miles away. It's the next town over. In fact, it's in the same township. And so now I can see here is my great-grandfather, Thomas Whitaker. And it says he's born in September 1894. The 1900 census is unique among U.S. census in that it's the only one that actually gives a month and birth year, or a month and year for birth. Yeah, in many places in Europe, there's a state church, and we'll get into that a little bit when we go back a little further on this line, because you're going to see pretty soon, because Thomas's grandfather was born in England, and we're going to look at those records to show you how they're different. And you can see this here. So here's Thomas's mom and dad. Edward is his father, born in June 1874, which is not exactly right, but sometimes that happened for some reason. He's 25. His wife, Caroline's 23, born in November 1876. They've been married for 6 years. They have had 3 children born to them. All 3 are still living, and that's Thomas, William, and Edwin right there. You can see here that Edward was born in Ohio. His wife, my great-great-grandmother, was born in Pennsylvania. You can see their parents' birthplaces. So Edward says his father was born in England. So now it's like, okay, there's an immigrant ancestor for me. Her father was born in Pennsylvania. Her mother was born in Pennsylvania. And then Edward's mother was born in Ohio, which is actually, again, not true, as we'll find out later. And this is why it's important to have multiple sources. If you just take information from one source, a lot of times it's wrong. Edward's just saying what he thinks. He doesn't remember that his mother was actually born in Lewistown, Pennsylvania. So he's like, yeah, mom's from Ohio, because she grew up in Ohio. She came here when she was 3 years old. So as far as Edward's concerned, his mother was from Ohio. But we'll see later that that's wrong. Hey, how's it going, Connor? So again, you can see here, Edward, my great-great-grandfather, he's a sheet mill catcher, is what he does. And this is an important thing here, too, because you're going to find this is pretty uncommon back in 1900. Edward and his wife, Caroline, can both read and write, and they speak English. They're renting their home, which, again, was very common, and it's a house, not a farm. That's all information I can get from the census. So now, Austin Curtis, you're descended from Devil Anse Hatfield? That's amazing. So now here's what I'm going to do. Did a doctor write? No, it's a census taker. And a lot of times, and something else I'll tell you that's really important, spelling is absolutely meaningless in records, especially when you're dealing with the majority of people, especially for me, family being from Kentucky, they were farmers. Most of them could not read or write. They could barely sign their own name. A lot of them would just sign an X. So they didn't know how to spell their own names. And so you'll see spellings all over the place with last names. That's how you end up with different last names being spelled differently. Because a lot of times it just depended on who was writing down the information, how it was spelled. So now I'm going to add Thomas's father, because I know his name was Edward. And we're going to enter in that he was born in 1874. And again, we're going to say Ohio, because we don't know specifically where in Ohio. And now we know that his mother's name was Caroline. Now, we don't know her maiden name yet, but we know she was born in November 1876 in Pennsylvania. So that's all we know. Did I spell that right? Let me take a look. Pennsylvania. Okay, I did. So now we've added that information. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you the hints, because the hints are a thing. And this is a real quick, easy way to save information to your tree, but it's important to know if it's right first. So I'm going to look right here. This is actually something I uploaded to my own tree. But this is something that somebody else has already found. In this case, I am that someone else. This is my great-great-grandfather's obituary. And actually, it's not the obituary. This is actually just the funeral notice. Let me find. Here's the... no, that's not it either. Where's the obituary? Here it is. Here's his obituary. So Ed Whitaker, 71, dies in hospital, retired steelworker. So here we go. Now this tells me a ton of information. Bro, Block, that's awesome. I appreciate that. The deceased was born in Niles, March 25th, 1874, the son of Joseph and Alva Granger Whitaker. Now again, that name is wrong for his mother, but we'll get to that. His wife, Caroline Croft Whitaker, so now we know her maiden name is Croft, died in 1918. So let's go back for a second. First of all, I'm going to save that to my tree. And I just hit save, and now that has been saved to my tree. But then look at this. Find a grave. And that's linked to Ancestry. And findagrave.com is a free site that is fantastic. And what that is that's a website where people enter in grave information. These are transcriptions of tombstones from cemeteries, and I've been a transcriber. I've gone around taking pictures. Sometimes people upload biographies to this. So let's take a look at that for a second. Now, we know he was born in 1874, and that he's in Niles, Ohio. So let's find Edward. There he is. So again, here we go. Born March 25th, 1874. Died 21st November in 1945 in Warren, Ohio. He died in Warren because Warren's where the hospital was. And he's buried in Niles Union Cemetery. Now check this out. And this is why Find a Grave is an awesome free resource if you can get connected to somebody on there. I've got his parents right here with their information. I've got his wife right here. I've got all 4 of his children, including my great-grandfather Thomas right here. And I can click on any one of those. Here's all his siblings. He was one of 16 kids, and most of the siblings are here. And I did most of this information myself. I linked all of this. But let's go ahead and look at Edward's father. Now, I took this picture. That statue is actually gone now from that. But I'm the one that took that picture that's been added to Find a Grave there. This lady added these other 2. But check this out. Okay, now I find his father, and it says September 1844 in Tipton, Metropolitan Borough of Sandwell, West Midlands, England. That's my great-great-great-grandfather. So just in what? We've been sitting here for 20 minutes. I've gotten back to my 3rd great-grandfather and my first immigrant ancestor. Just like that. So that's really cool. One of the cool things about this and how easy it is to find. Insane. I'm working on it, my friend. It's been tough because the Dutch records are not very good. No, I don't have any Whitaker family in Mississippi. I do have Winsteads in Mississippi. But yeah, Find a Grave does have. Because check this out. I'll keep going back. I'll click on Mary Lambert Whitaker. This is my my fourth great-grandmother. She's born in Tipton, died in Cleveland. And then here's her father, Joseph. And this is one of my guys who owned a pub in England. And Joseph was born in Whitchurch, Cardiff, Wales. He died in 1861 in Tipton. And he's buried in St. Bartholomew's Cemetery in Wednesbury in the West Midlands. So there you go. There's some English information there. So let's back up for a second because, again, I can add all of this right to my tree directly from Find a Grave. So now we're going to update his birth information right there. His death information is going to be added. We're going to add his parents to the tree. Elvira was my great-great-great-grandmother's name. And you can see here she's born in Lewistown, Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, which is in the center part of the state. We've got her death date here. And we're going to add all of that to the tree, just like that. Bradley, your family were born in Tipton? That's amazing. My Tipton ancestors, the Whitakers, actually lived in Prince's End. And you'll see in just a second when I get back that far, Joseph Whitaker's father, Richard, and his grandfather, Joseph, ran a pub that's still there today. It's on Church Lane. It's called the English Oak. And I actually reached out to the owners of that pub, and they were familiar with the name Joseph Lambert. Romanian records are decent, believe it or not. And McMaster, it is not Elvira. I don't know how you might have known somebody else who had it pronounced that way, but that is not how my great-great-great-grandmother's name was pronounced. Paul, you're from Glasgow. So let's talk about Glasgow for a second, because we're going to look at Joseph. So here's one of the big issues I had early on. I've been researching the Whitaker. I just wrote a book about the Whitaker family a couple of years ago. There were two Whitaker families in Niles. Joseph and then a guy named Alfred, who was born in Scotland. And from all the records and everything I could see, it seemed like these families were related to each other. And I was convinced they had to be brothers, but I couldn't get past the fact that Joseph was born in England and Alfred was born in Scotland. And it just really messed with me for a long time. And then I discovered that when Joseph was 2 years old, his father moved the family to Glasgow, Scotland. And he ran a pub there called the Old Toll, which is actually still there today. Mexico's got some decent records on Ancestry, actually. Scandinavian records, yeah, a little bit. I've done some research for some folks in Sweden and Norway. They were actually full brothers, John. Joseph was born when they lived in England. The other one was born when they lived in Scotland. But those are a lot of questions that I had at the time. So let's go ahead and look at Joseph now. So Joseph, again, lives in Niles, which is where the family was all from. I want to look now at some of the records. For example, let's go back to... I want to go to one of the census records. So here's that same 1900 census. Filipino records I haven't done much with. Hungary, my wife's grandfather's Hungarian, so I've done a lot of research there. They've got a lot of really good records on Ancestry and Family Search for Hungary. Japanese, I don't know much about East Asian records, unfortunately. So here's Joseph and Elvira, and you can see this is how she actually spelled her name, Elvira. August 1856. Now, Joseph's birth date is wrong. He was not born in May 1839. Again, this is a common thing. The records are very scattered when it comes to birth dates on things like that. Zero. Look at my pinned comment. We're not talking about that today. Call sign, yes. Buying Ancestry membership is absolutely worth it. So now, Joseph, born in England. Father, born in England. Mother, born in England. This tells me he came to the United States in 1865. He's been in the U.S. for 35 years. It tells me he's a naturalized citizen, so I know he's got his citizenship. He's an American citizen at this point. Now, his occupation is making, this says fagels, but that's actually wrong. The person who transcribed this didn't know what they were doing and probably didn't want to type what it really is. And I should be able to submit a correction to this. He was actually making faggots. Faggot is a term for a bundle of sticks. In this case, it's a bundle of steel rods. He worked in a rolling mill, and they would make steel rods there for use in concrete and things like that. And so it was his job to bundle those together into a faggot, as it was called. It wasn't a derogatory term, at least not that I'm aware of at the time. Prussian and German records are very good. So then you can see the whole family here. You can see his kids, his 24-year-old daughter, his daughter Sadie, Arilla, Annie, Sarah, Thomas. In this case, this is my great-grandfather's uncle Thomas, Georgina, Charles, and then Prudence. And you can see what they're doing, opening tin. So some of them were working at a tin factory. You can see that Joseph can read, but he can't write. Again, very common. He can speak English. He owns his house. It's mortgaged, and it's a house, not a farm. Elvira cannot read or write. Records in the Baltics I haven't done a lot of. So now we know Joseph came to the United States around 1865. So let's take a look at that again. Let's go back a little further. Now this is the 1880 census. And again, this is going to be Joseph again. So we can look 20 years earlier, look at a little more of his information. So here's Joseph again. This is in Niles still, where they lived. Joseph, 38. Elva, it says, 24, but this is still Elvira. You're going to see that. Very common thing to see the names written down differently. The census taker is just going to write it down how they think it is, and they're going to sometimes screw it up. Born in England, born in England, born in England. Now, if you remember when we were looking at this, do you remember, here's what it says about Elvira's name. Now, there's two names here, and that's a tricky thing. But Granger, it lists her as a Granger. Now, that's important because when you're looking at the census, look at who they lived near. The next door neighbors to Joseph and Elvira are Benjamin and Ann Granger. Benjamin's a blacksmith. He's from England. Ann is born in Pennsylvania. Now, where did Elvira say her father and mother were born? Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now, this is tricky. Elvira's mother was born in Pennsylvania. This is Elvira screwing up again. And this is something you have to deal with records. You have to deal with a lot of incorrect information and try to piece together a picture based on multiple sources. So, evening, Rad. How's it going? So Anne is Elvira's mother, and Benjamin is actually her stepfather. And that's why you see two last names. You see what the other last name was? Nyman. Now, look over here. Right next door on the other side of Benjamin Granger is a James Nyman. It's actually Elvira's full brother. They both have the same mom and dad. This is Anne's son on this side, and this is Anne's daughter on this side. So they're both living next door to their mom and their stepdad. And so it's pretty cool to kind of see all of that work itself out. But now let's go ahead. And I'm flying through this. It'll probably take you hours to go through all of this stuff. But you'll find 9 times out of 10, once you get back a couple generations to maybe like your great-great-grandparents, chances are really good that somebody else has already worked on at least part of your family tree. Joseph Whitaker has over 1,000 living descendants today that I know of. And so with 1,000 living descendants and with the popularity of genealogy these days in America especially, chances are pretty good that several other people have done research on Joseph already. So you're going to find what other people have already done. Have I done George Washington's family history? No, there's plenty of people who have done that already. So Cryptic Panda, I like typically when I do it, and I'm cheap compared to most, I do 10 hours of research for $200. I'm probably going to have to stop doing that, though, because after I advertised that on a video about 2 weeks ago, I got like 30 people who reached out to me wanting to hire me. So I've got a bit of a waiting list now. But Ancestry charges $2,500 for 20 hours of research. That's why I highly recommend, if you can, to get a membership and start doing this stuff yourself, because really it is pretty easy to get started. Now, once you get back and you have to start going into some really obscure records, it can get really difficult. But here's what's cool now. Let me show you some other resources to find with these people. Newspapers are fantastic resources for information. I'm going to go, this is one I already know about. The Niles Times was the local newspaper in Niles, Ohio. So I'm going to look up Elvira Whitaker, who's my third great-grandmother that we've been talking about, and see what I can find about her. So let's take a look right here. Here's a mention of Elvira Granger Whitaker in a newspaper article from 1958. So, and what it is this is her son's obituary. So these are the kinds of things you can find just really quick doing a little search. And this is a free site that I'm on right now. So Charles Whitaker, 61, of Huntington Park, California, resident of Niles until 9 years ago. And see here, born in Niles, August 1897, he was the son of the late Joseph and Elvira Granger Whitaker. It lists his widow, his children, his brothers and sisters that are living. You can find all kinds of really cool information. Let me show you another example of somebody asked about skeletons in the closet. My paternal great-grandfather also lived in Niles, and his name was Carl Snowden, and I know that he died in 1956. So I'm going to look for his obituary in 1956. And here we go. I'm going to find this right here. He died in December, just after Christmas. So here's my great-grandfather's obituary. And you can see here, this is one of those examples. Sometimes you're going to find stuff you don't want to find about your ancestors. And in this case, this is my father's father's father. His death was ruled a suicide by hanging. He used an extension cord and took his own life when he was, I think, 46 years old. Luis, I'm going to be going for a little while yet. CM17, my last name is not my biological father's name either. My last name is my mother's maiden name. I didn't know who my biological father was until about 10 years ago, and it was from an ancestry DNA test. Scottish clan genealogical records are decent, I think, but I haven't dug into them enough to be able to tell you for sure. So let me show you some other resources now. In particular, I'm going to switch over to my main family tree now, because I want to show you. So here's what this is my actual family tree here. So what I want to show you now is I want to show you how to research military history a little bit. So let's go to that same line we were just working on. We're going to go to Caroline, who we talked about. And I'm going to go to her grandfather. His name was Daniel Cervey. So Daniel Cervey is born in 1819 in Center County, Pennsylvania, which is where State College is, where Penn State University is. Yes, this is definitely possible if you live outside the U.S. A lot of these records that I've researched are from outside the U.S. Now, I told you the census is every 10 years. In 1890, the U.S. Census burned in a fire. The 1890 census burned in a fire, I should say. I think the fire was like in the 1920s or 30s. But what did survive was a special census they did in 1890 of all Union veterans who were still living. So if you suspect that you have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War, at least on the Union side, and you know he was living in 1890, he will show up in the 1890 veteran census, and he will say, what unit he was in, when he enlisted, and when he left the service, if he remembers. So in this case, Dan Cervey, I know that he was alive in 1890. He died in 1894. So, and we know he lived in a place called Curlsville in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. And so this is the Veteran Census for Monroe and Curlsville in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. Bradley, very cool. I'm going to be hopefully going to Tipton as soon as travel clears up again. So now we're going to look down this list and we're going to find our guy. So here's Daniel W. Cervey right here. And it tells me that he was a sergeant in Company I of the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and that he enlisted October 14th, 1861, and that he stayed in that unit until July 1st, 1865. Now that's super unusual for somebody to be in the service that long, because most of those enlistments were 3 years, and the majority of people did not re-enlist when their 3 years were up. So the fact that he stayed until 65 is a pretty big deal, and that tells me a lot about the guy, that he did that. Now, it also tells me if he's dealing with any health issues, because they're trying to figure out who's going to be filing for a veteran's pension, things like that. So here he is. He's line 26. He says he's got an enlargement of the heart. But that's all he says about it. So Company I, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. So now that gives me some more to do research on. And I use a site called civilwardata.com. When did I want to become a historian? When I was 8 years old. I actually, from the time I was 8, wanted to be a history professor. I wanted to teach in a university, and I majored in history in college, but never ended up doing that. So this is a database I use, and again, it's a pay site, but there's a lot of other places you can find this information. But I'm going to go to the personnel directory, and I'm going to type in now, again, the names are pretty tricky, but I'm going to type in Daniel Cervey. We know he served from Pennsylvania. And I'm going to search. And there he is, Daniel W. Cervey. Now, this doesn't tell me a lot, because what this tells me is actually his re-enlistment. He was already a sergeant at this time. So that doesn't give me a lot of great information. So I'm going to look somewhere else for this information. I'm just going to type in... I want to learn a little more about the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, so I'm actually just going to do a Google search for the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and I'm like, oh, wow, look at this. There's a monument to the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry at Gettysburg, which means that my ancestor, because he was there from October 1861 to July 1865, which means he was in that unit in July of 1863 when they were at the Battle of Gettysburg. So now I know that my fourth great-grandfather was at the Battle of Gettysburg in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Do American people hate the Southern generals from the Civil War? Some, yeah. I am not one of those people, and a lot of people look up to the Southern generals. So, but yeah, I'm just catching up here. 4th great-grandfather served in the Kentucky 14th Cavalry. Yeah, you know, Nate Carlo, the vast majority of people in those Kentucky units, which is most of my ancestors as well, died on like scouting raids and things like that, because they didn't fight in major battles for the most part, most of them. So can we do the same with ancestors that fought in the American Revolution? Oh gosh, there's a fantastic resource for Revolutionary War ancestors. Fold 3 has a ton of military records on it. And when I say a ton, I really do mean a ton. So let me just tell you one, for example. I have an ancestor who I know served in the Revolution and who had a pension in the Revolution. All the Revolutionary War pension files are on Fold 3. So this is really cool. I'm going to look at Peter Stillwagon and his wife Elizabeth. And I just found his complete Revolutionary War pension file. Look across the bottom at all of these pages of documents from the National Archives that are available for me to research. And these are all original documents. These are images of original documents. So this is just a letter from Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Be it known that on the 5th day of January, A.D. 1855, before me the undersigned register for the probate of wills in and for the said county. And what he's saying here is to point out the fact that this lady died. And this is talking about the estate of Elizabeth Stillwagon, who was the pensioner on behalf of her husband's military service. But you can see here, this tells me that Peter Stillwagon, my ancestor, that he served in the Revolution for 5 years. He enlisted around the time of the Declaration of Independence near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He served 5 years. He marched to New Jersey, where he served as a sergeant under Captain Stephen Fleming, Colonel Holmes, and General Foreman at Colts Neck, Monmouth, and Eatontown. So now I know my ancestor was in the Battle of Monmouth from this, near which the last named place he was taken prisoner and confined in the old Sugar House, New York City, which, by the way, there's a monument to in one of the walls of the old Sugar House prison. It's still there in downtown New York, in downtown Manhattan, for a year and 11 months. He died in December 1831. His widow, Elizabeth, was allowed pension on an application from 1846, at which time she was a resident of Connellsville, Fayette County, and 95 years of age. Now, you may remember that it said she died in 1855, which means she lived another 9 years after this. She was married to him in 1773 and died in 1855. From a mutilated cutting from the family Bible, it would appear that Peter Stillwagon and his wife were married the 10th day of March in the year of our Lord, 1775. So that is all available online, which is really cool. But that stuff you find once you know. Like, once you find out who your ancestors are, now you start digging into stuff about them. You know, if I know I've got an ancestor who was born in the 1890s, I'm looking to see if they fought in World War I. Now, if you're an American and they were American, it's much less likely. I would say 1 in 10 men of military age born in the 1890s probably served overseas in World War I in the U.S. But if your ancestors in the UK or France or Germany, you can almost 100% guarantee if they were born in the 1890s, they probably served in the military. Now, I want to go back to Ancestry for a minute, because let's talk about UK records for just a second now. There's a ton here. I want to show you an example of some of the records that are available for people in the UK. Let me find one of them. Here we go. So here's Joseph Corden, who's somebody I've been doing research on. He's a relative of mine. He's a third cousin. But I've been doing research on him because he was killed July 1st, 1917 in France. So World War I. Now I can find information about him. Here's some England census records. Here's a World War I pension ledger for Joseph Corden. And now I can see right here from this, he was in the Nottingham and Derbyshire Regiment. He was from the West Midlands. He died 1st July 1917. He was a private. I can see his mother is listed as the person who received the pension on his behalf. Here's a listing for him in the Commonwealth War Graves information. So right here he is. Private Joseph Corden. Here's his service number. He was in the 1-5 battalion of the Sherwood Foresters. And again, he died 1st July 1917. So those are the informations you can get into. And you can actually dig further and actually find his military records. Those are all available on Ancestry. Let me see if I can find any of that real quick. But there's a couple of other sites I want to show you here in just a minute. Soldiers Who Died in the Great War is another resource that's available on here. And one of the reasons I like Ancestry is based on the information you have in your tree, it will find other records that it suggests to you that might be the same guy. It doesn't 100% guarantee it, but it's very likely. So, for example here, 1901 census. Now, we know from that other record his mother's name was Hannah. So this is probably him, right? This is a UK census. This is Derby County, the civil parish of Derby, and the town of Derby. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm pretty sure in the UK they pronounce Derby as Darby. So they're split on 2 pages, actually. This is the children. The parents are on the other page. Born in Burton-on-Trent. And so you can see they probably moved right here. Joseph, he was 7 at his last birthday, born in Burton-on-Trent. But then right after that, the other children are born in Derby. So they probably moved at that point. Blake, that's okay. The whole thing's going to be available online later on the channel, so you'll be able to see it all afterward. I want to show you one other thing about Civil War records that are really cool on Fold 3. So I'm going to go ahead and look for one of my relatives that I know was in a unit, because his is a pretty fascinating story. If I can find it. If I can spell his name right. Okay. I think this is the guy I want. So Henderson Gearhart is an uncle of mine who was in the Civil War, and I actually don't want this record. These are the Civil War service records. English records, really easy back to 1838, because that's when the government started keeping records. Before that, it's gonna depend on the church. Most of the records before 1838 are going to be church parish records, which are pretty good for the most part. And I'll show you a couple of those here in a minute. But I want to show you Henderson Gearhart's military service records, because the Civil War service records are really cool. I'm going to go back and browse this from the top, because it's a little easier for me to do it that way, since I already know what I'm looking for. Civil War service records are broken down by state. Some states have more information than others. Like Pennsylvania and Ohio, they only have the index. They don't have the full records. Kentucky's got all the records for both sides, Confederate and Union. So I'm going to go to the Union side. And I know that this guy served in the 39th Kentucky Infantry. Mounted infantry. And his last name's G, so I'm going to go there. And I'm going to look for him. And here he is, Henderson. And this says Gayhart, because that was actually how they pronounced it down in Kentucky, was Gayhart, even though it's Gearhart. Now, this is going to tell me a lot about Henderson. It's going to tell me he was a private in Company F, 39th Kentucky Infantry. He was 18 years old when he enlisted. He mustered in at Peach Orchard, Kentucky, February 16th, 1863, is when this roll was dated. He actually mustered in December 18th of 62 for a period of 3 years. German records go back pretty far, and again, it's really mostly church records. That's going to be the case for a lot of Europe. Here, every 2 months, there was a recorded company muster roll. So you have one for January and February, you have one for March and April, one for June and July, or May and June, etc. So this is the muster roll for Company G, 39th Kentucky, from the enlistment to February 28th. He's listed as the 8th corporal for the company. Pretty standard here, Corporal Company F. Not a lot interesting until you get right here. Now it says this is the roll from May and June of 63. He's listed as absent for that roll. And the reason he's absent, he was captured by the rebels June 27th, 1863 in Breathitt County, Kentucky. So now I know he's been captured. Okay, what happened to him? Well, I hate to say it, but you don't want to really know what happened to people captured in Kentucky by the rebels in the summer and fall of 1863. And we're going to find out in just a minute what happened to him. Because it keeps on saying the same thing. Every roll is going to say the same thing. Captured in Breathitt County, Kentucky. Captured in Breathitt County, Kentucky. So what's the end result? We don't know what the end result is. We're going to go to the end and hope that maybe at the end of the war it gives us some other information about what happened to him. Because all the muster record or the rolls are saying the same thing. for every 2-month period. It says this. All right, and here we go. Henderson H. Gearhart, Company, Corporal Company F. Here's the muster out roll. They're going to kind of give the final disposition. Remarks, died at Andersonville, Georgia. Date not known. So now I know. I don't know when. And he's obviously in an unmarked grave. Or not an unmarked grave. He's in an unknown grave. So when I go to Andersonville next month, I'm going to see all those unknown graves. And I'm going to know that in one of those is my great-great-great-grandfather's brother, brother Henderson, who was just 19 years old when he died in that awful, awful place, Andersonville. And this is why, for me, family history is so amazing. Because now I've got a personal connection to something I read about in the history books. And, I read about Andersonville being this awful place that was kind of like a Nazi concentration camp. But now it's personal. Now it affected my family. My grandpa's great-grandfather had a brother who died there. And I actually will later find out that on my dad's side, I had another uncle who died in Andersonville. I had 2 uncles who died in Andersonville. So that just makes it much more personal. And when I go there next month, it's not just going to be a bunch of people who are unknown to me. It's going to be, this is part of my family story. When I talk about the Battle of Monmouth, my 5th great-grandfather, Peter Stillwagon, fought at the Battle of Monmouth. And I can look and I can see exactly where he was that day. I know that my ancestor Samuel Hughes was in the 20th Ohio. And when I go and I look and I see that the 20th Ohio was at the Battle of Shiloh, and I'm thinking, wow, that's cool. I wonder what he did at the Battle of Shiloh. I wonder where he fought. And then I find out, he was in Lew Wallace's division. Lew Wallace's division is the one that got lost when they were supposed to be reinforcing. And they marched around half the day. And Grant was really mad at Lew Wallace because he didn't show up on the battlefield to help them defend Pittsburgh Landing. My 5th great-grandfather was one of the men marching with Lew Wallace all over the place and then led off the attack on the following day. When they started the counterattack on the second day of the Battle of Shiloh, it was Lew Wallace's division. Later on, 20th Ohio was part of John Logan's division at Vicksburg. They were the very first Union division to march into the town of Vicksburg after it surrendered. My family was a part of that. My ancestor was in that division that marched into Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. So that gives me a personal connection to this. That's why I love it so much. And every one of us has that kind of history. Now, some lines are harder than others to research. I'll show you one of my family lines that's really tricky, and you'll understand why when I show it to you. So let me show you my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Mary Howard, and she lived here, and our lives almost overlapped. She died in 1965, so about 12 years before I was born. So this is Mary Howard. She's my great-great-grandmother, and this is her husband, my great-great-grandfather. Now, you may notice that she looks like she's got a pretty dark complexion. Now, there's a reason for that. And you're going to find that in the census records. Let's take a look for a second at the 1910 census in Carter County, Kentucky. So Nada is my great-grandmother, okay? Nada had just been born. She's not even 2 years old in this census record. Robert and Mary are my great-great-grandparents, the ones I just showed you that picture of. Now, take a look right here at race. Robert is white. Mary and their 2 children, Hiram and Nada, are MU. Yeah, some kind of Appalachian ancestors is absolutely right. They were 100%. MU is mulatto. Okay, so they're mixed race. My great-grandmother's listed as mixed race in the census. Her parents are listed as mixed race in the census. So now that's got me intrigued, right? Her mother, Mary, who I know her maiden name was Howard, and that's the one I just showed you the picture of. She's born in Kentucky. She's born around 1878 or so, because she's 1888, I should say. She's 22 in the 1910 census. I actually know from her obituary She was born October 18th, 1885 in Magoffin County, Kentucky. So, and now I'm going to show you what I was able to find after a ton of research on her mother, my great-great-great-grandmother, Peggy. Okay. There's Peggy Caudle, my great-great-great-grandmother. Now you can see how she's listed. B. She's black. Now, if you are 30 years old in 1880 and you're black and you're living in Kentucky, there's a really good chance that you were not a free person before 1865. So now I'm thinking, okay, my great-great-great-grandmother was probably born into slavery. Now, I can't assume that because there were free black people living in Kentucky at that time. But Peggy Caudle, she's a domestic servant. Now, interestingly, she's actually living around all of these Howard family members. And through a lot of research I've done, I found out that Peggy Caudle, that the father of my great-great-grandmother, Mary Howard, was a married man named Golson Howard, who was married to another woman and actually had a sexual relationship with Peggy Caudle, this black woman. He couldn't marry her. You know, they couldn't have interracial marriage at that time, but he did have a child with her, and that's who my great-great-grandmother is. Yeah, Caudle, and Caudle is the name of the owner, and you'll see that going back another generation. Cheney Caudle is one of my absolute favorite ancestors, and I know so very little about her, because Cheney was born, I know for sure from doing research, was born into slavery in 1835. This is my fourth great-grandmother, as you can see right here. And I know so very little about her. But I can look here. At Cheney. Now, this one's pretty hard to read because this census taker did not really think too much about the people that were going to be reading these years later. But there's Cheney. There's Peggy, her daughter. There's her daughter, Mary. And then this is another child here, Genoa Caudle. And I come to find out through doing a lot of research that Cheney had something like 8 kids. And she wasn't married to the father of most of them. We are 99% sure that the father of Cheney's children was her owner. We can't confirm that for sure, but his last name was Caudle, and she actually took the name of her owner. So I'm fairly certain that my fourth great grandfather is the owner of Cheney Caudle, and DNA records have kind of backed that up through Ancestry DNA. Now, how do I know for sure that these are the right, and how did I know in the first place to be looking for black ancestors? Well, first of all, seeing my great-grandmother listed as mulatto was a dead ringer, a dead giveaway for that. But I want to show you something else. Let me show you my DNA. Here's what it shows my DNA estimate. 51% England and Northwestern Europe, 31% Scotland, 12% Ireland, 2% Wales, 2% Cameroon, Congo, and Western Bantu peoples, 1% Nigeria, 1% Ivory Coast and Ghana. So just based on the DNA that I've inherited, about 4% of that comes from sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously I got that from somewhere. And in this case, I know about where that came from. I can also see that most of my family tree, Ohio, and then this area here. 3 of my 4 grandparents, their roots are in eastern Kentucky, so that fits perfectly with my DNA. Now, going back a little further, you can actually get really specific. Check this out. I'm going to go now to my grandmother, the one that we were just doing research on, Connie. It could tell me not only does she have roots in England, but specifically the West Midlands of England, which we know because we know that doing research that her family came from Tipton, which is right down here in Dudley. This is about where Tipton is, right here. West Brom. That's why I root for West Brom. You always see me wearing the Albion shirts because that's where they are from, right there. I have not studied the Empire of Congo, so I should. Yeah, that is where they took most slaves from. It was from right along this coast, right in here. That's where most slavery happened. Yeah, it does include Calais on the English ancestry. And you'll notice, too, it not only includes Calais on the English ancestry, but a lot of times, depending on what source you look at, it will also include Scandinavia, because you have to remember that if you have roots in the UK, especially in this part of the UK, there's a good chance that your roots go back to Scandinavia because so much of that was infiltrated by them. Yes, they can compare your genes, and specifically, I can actually see matches, which is really cool too. And looking at my aunt, this is my aunt on my paternal side, and so she's a generation closer to these people. And you can see hers actually shows Chad and Molly as well, and she's got just a little bit more of that sub-Saharan African DNA. And then actually, I can actually look into my records and I can see second and third cousins who are 100% African American. They look black, and because they're descended from Cheney Caudle, but through her relationships with black men rather than her relationship with her owner, where she had a mulatto child. And so I have cousins who are second and third cousins, close relatives, who you would look at me and you would look at them and you'd think they are not related, but they are. I'm about as white as you can get, and they're as black as you can get, and we're of the same family. So again, and I know this can be a sensitive topic, and I want to be respectful of this. I'm not trying to say that I know the experience of what it means to be black in America, because I obviously do not. But now when I learn about slavery, it's got a personal connection. My great-great-great-grandmother was born into slavery. Now I look in the mirror and I don't look like somebody who would have an ancestor who was born into slavery, but I do. And now, when I read about the Emancipation Proclamation, when I read about the 13th Amendment, that has a personal connection to me, because that affected my family's lives. And I also know from doing research that even after they married, that 1910 census you saw, where we saw my great-grandmother as a 2-year-old living in eastern Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky was not the best place in the world for a mixed marriage to take place, a white man and a mulatto woman. So Mary and her family actually had to leave eastern Kentucky. They went to, I'm trying to remember exactly where it is. Let me find the census. They went to an area near Chillicothe, Ohio, in Ross County, Ohio, because there was a big migration of people of mixed race and even black people from eastern Kentucky into southern Ohio, where they were much more accepted and did not face the discrimination that they did in eastern Kentucky. And so that's where my family goes initially, and then eventually they come to northeast Ohio. So that's Cola Chill. That's something you have to decide for yourself about the DNA thing. I personally didn't have any qualms about it. But, if you're not comfortable with that, that's something you have to decide for yourself. But I have found so much information. I've actually broken some brick walls. I actually never would have found Cheney Caudle without DNA. I never would have found anything on my dad's side of the family. I never would have known who my biological father was, except for Ancestry DNA. But Cheney Caudle, what put me onto her was I couldn't find the records. And then I started finding that I had a bunch, like I'm talking dozens of DNA matches to other living people who were all descendants of this woman, Cheney Caudle. And I thought, okay, it can't be a coincidence that I have 24 ancestors, or 24 cousins who are all descended from the same lady. She's got to be an ancestor of mine too. And so I actually worked my way down from her and made the connection to my great-great-grandmother that way. Thor, I appreciate that. Thank you. I would love to visit Africa where my ancestors lived, and I wish that I knew a little further back on Cheney's line. Unfortunately, I don't. I can't get past Cheney. And I'll show you why. In fact, I want to go ahead and show you. Let's stick on this topic of slavery for just a second. Because I'm thinking, okay, I know that Cheney was in Magoffin County, Kentucky. There was something that they did called the slave census. Because they had to count the slaves, right, for the whole 3/5 compromise. Slave-owning states, slaves counted for 3/5 of a person as far as apportionments go, things like that, which is just obscene to me that that's something they did, but it was something they did. So I want to go to the slave census and see if I can find Cheney in the 1860 slave census. And it's tricky to do that, but it is possible. So I'm going to try to narrow this down. North America. Narrow it down specifically to 1860. And some of the stuff I'm doing right now just comes from having done this for a long time. I can make my way around this really easily. Okay, there's one slave owner in Magoffin County, Kentucky in 1860 with the last name Caudle. And you can see here, again, spelling means nothing. Abigail Caudle. And she owns several slaves. And you notice they don't have names for those slaves. But what they do have are genders and ages. So there's a 28-year-old female owned by Abigail Caudle. She's black. She's born around 1832. That's my Cheney. So this is all I know of Cheney in the 1860 census. Is she's a black female owned by Abigail Caudle. That's her story. That's what I know of it, unfortunately. And you can see they have one slave house, it says. And so you can almost guarantee that the 10-year-old male, the 8-year-old male, the 6-year-old female, the 4-year-old male, and the 1-year-old male are her kids. You notice there's no husband. Where do you think they came from? And you can see the 1-year-old, M. That means mulatto. That means mixed race. That means Cheney has had a relationship, probably not consensual, with a white man and had a child. Probably all of these children in this case. The process, if the records are good, the vault guy, the records are pretty good. I mean, I was working on my family tree for 20 years before DNA was really an option. So the records are pretty good. DNA, more than anything, helps confirm a lot of the information you already have found. But occasionally, Ancestry DNA tests, usually they run sales. They're about $59 when they go on sale. It's not too bad. They take care of everybody, the folks that just stepped out. Ancestry, Asian records, I've never really dealt with too much. I don't think they have a ton of Asian records. What is your general approach to present these after doing the research for someone? Great question, Cryptic Panda. When it comes to certain things that are sensitive, if I'm doing a limited amount of research for somebody, so say when I work on somebody's family tree, and I am I'm doing 10 hours of research, okay? And so I have a limited amount of time that I'm working on that. Let's look at a family tree. This is one I worked on and did some research for somebody. Basically what I'll do is I'll give them, you get a link to all of this, and so they can log in and see all the same information that I'm showing you. They can look at all of this. I'll usually make a video for them, just kind of highlighting some of what I found and showing them some of the really interesting things. I'll put the records in there for sensitive things because the records are the records. I won't go out of my way with certain stuff. I did research for somebody recently, and I found out through the process of doing research on their family tree that their great-grandfather was in prison for rape. I didn't tell them. I didn't even add the record. I was torn about that. But in this case, if they didn't already know that their great-grandfather had been in prison for rape, I wasn't going to go out of my way to tell them about it. If they wanted to keep digging and they found it on their own, fine. But I felt like, even though the records were public, I felt like it just wasn't my place to tell them that. It was difficult for me to do that. I've run into that in other situations. I've got a situation right now where I've got a relative that I've done DNA research for, and I know that their father's father is not their biological father because of the DNA. I haven't told them. I'm really torn on that, and that's something I've gone back and forth with a long time. Danish records are going to mostly be church records if you go back. That's mostly the case in Europe if you go back pretty far. There's so many, it varies so much from one country to the next. History Explained, thank you. 23andMe versus Ancestry. Great question. If you are mostly interested in things, I'll show you 23andMe because I have that too. I actually just recently did 23andMe. If you are more interested in the medical side of things, like wanting to know if you are predisposed to certain illnesses and things like that, and you want to know the breakdown, like what percentage of your family tree came from Scotland and came from France. If that's mostly what you're interested in, I would recommend 23andMe as the way to go. If you want to be able to connect with other people and use DNA as a tool for researching your family tree better, I would say Ancestry is better for that. So here's my 23andMe. And you'll see my report, and you'll see that it's slightly different than what Ancestry says. Because their algorithms are different, their database is different. You can see the sub-Saharan Africans about the same, 4.5%. And it says Nigeria, 1.6%. Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, broadly West African, 0.1%. Congo, Southeast African, etc. You can see here, this one's got 2.3% French and German. Now, you have to understand something, too, about all of this. And you can see, actually, specific, again, high probability I've got matches from London, high probability of Birmingham, and I know that both of my mom's parents had great-grandfathers that were born in the Birmingham area. One lived in Birmingham City. The other one lived in Tipton. So, right there is a lot of my roots. Up here around Manchester, Leeds. So now we're talking a little bit more in the north of England. I've got some roots. But you have to remember, this does not define who your ancestors were. This tells you what DNA you inherited. My sister could do Ancestry DNA, and her matches, her percentages are going to be a little different because you and siblings both inherit different pieces of DNA from your parents. You get 50% from each parent, but you might not get the same 50% from each parent. So my sister could just as easily show up with a higher percentage of British than I have, or a lower percentage of Irish than I have. So this is a guide that helps you. And look, you can see Glasgow, same thing. And I know I've got roots in Glasgow. It's a guide, but don't let this define you. Like if you do this and you don't have any Native American ancestry, don't be like, oh man, my parents lied to me when they said that I had a Cherokee ancestor. It doesn't mean you don't. It just means that you personally did not inherit any of the Cherokee DNA. It doesn't mean it's not there. Why does 23andMe light up the entire Europe, Russia? I don't know. And let me show you another great example of that. My wife's grandfather, both of his parents were born in Hungary. But so in theory, my wife should be 25% Hungarian, right? One of her four grandparents was 100% Hungarian. But when I show you her DNA, you're going to see it doesn't come out quite like that. She doesn't show up as 25% Hungarian. Look at how she shows up. She's got 12% Eastern Europe and Russia, which of course includes parts of Hungary, but could also be Poland, Ukraine, Slovakia, Russia, any of those places. 6% Ireland, 4% the Balkans. And again, kind of overlaps Hungary a little bit. I know specifically that her great-grandparents, one of them was from the area west of Budapest. The other one was from right up here near the border with Slovakia. So chances are, if you go back enough generations, they probably were different ethnicities. And then she's got 3% Sweden. So she doesn't show up just straight 25% Hungarian, because you got to remember, just because they came from Hungary doesn't mean if you go back 4 more generations that they were Hungarian. That's just kind of the way it goes. Yes, I have read that article about Chaney Caudle Collins. Very cool. That's one of my cousins who wrote that. Yes, Hungarians are not Slavs. You're correct. Portugal's records are decent, but a lot of them are in Portuguese. DNA tests, it depends on how busy they are at any given time. My 23andMe test, from the time I mailed it, it was like 3 weeks until I got the records. I've seen Ancestry take as long as 7 or 8 weeks, sometimes less. Soviet and Russian Empire records, I've only done a little bit. Interesting thing, so for example, I've done some research for people in Poland. You go back 100 years, and what you're dealing with are not Polish records. You're dealing with either Prussian records or Russian records. And you'll see the information listed as either Prussian Poland or German Poland or as Russian Poland, depending on what part of Poland they lived in. For my wife, when I'm researching records from Hungary in 1900, you'll see a lot of the times, let me show you a perfect example of this. And this is why it's good to know history. So if I know in my wife's family tree, let me go to my wife's great-grandfather right here. So here's my wife's great-grandfather. So I know he was born in Saho St. Peter in Hungary. Okay, but if I look at the 1910 census, it says he was born in Hungary. But if I look at the 1920 census, now it says that he was born in Hungary, but he speaks Slovak. So now I'm really confused. But if I go back to, I think it's the 1900 census or some of the other records are going to tell me he was born in Austria. Now, obviously, he wasn't born in Austria, but he was born in Austria-Hungary. And in some of the records, they list it as Austria, even though he was Hungarian. Excuse me. My monster went down the wrong pipe. I use a translator. Great question. There's some records that are in the foreign language, and when you see the records often enough, you start to figure out what certain words mean. Like I know if I'm looking at a German record, geboren means born. Ruhet on a tombstone means rests or here lies. Things like that. You start to pick up words. So I have a passable knowledge of what genealogical words are in different languages, enough to where I can tell what I'm looking at. And when I can't, a lot of times I'll use the translator on my phone, and I'll actually hold it right up to the screen, and it'll translate it for me on the screen. Because there's a lot of records in Hungarian I can do that way. What kind of monster? It's the 0 sugar ones. It's energy, Monster Energy Ultimate or Ultra Sunrise. It's the 0 calorie ones. I get a 12-pack of them, and I usually drink one a day. Favorite is the apple. I love the apple monster flavor. Do you create your own roots, or are they created? I'm not sure what you mean by that. And actually, yes, that one record said Slovak, but I know that was actually, whoever wrote that down was wrong, because they did speak Hungarian. My mother-in-law remembers hearing her grandmother speak Hungarian as a child. And Dutch records, I've had some trouble, Evan, with Dutch records. I think it may just be that a lot of them aren't online yet. So, when I started doing my family tree, I actually had to go to libraries. Like right now where I'm pulling up these census records and just looking at the digital images, I had to drive up to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, pull out microfilm, and scroll through it by hand to find these records, which now I can just pull up online. So here, you can see this is the same family that said they spoke Slovak in the 1920 census. And here it says Magyar, which is Hungarian. And this tells me he came in 1905. His wife came in 1928. This is actually his second wife. He went back to Hungary to find another wife after his first one died. He's a coal miner, which is pretty common for Hungarians who settled in central Pennsylvania to be coal miners. Here's my wife's grandfather. You guys have heard me talk about him. He's the one that was a ball turret gunner on a B-17. That's John here. I knew him well, one of the greatest men I've ever known. And so he was the first of his family to be born in America. If you wanted to have me research your family history, what type of info would you need? The DNA stuff's not really necessary because the amount of digging I would be getting into in 10 hours of research wouldn't get me to the place where I would need DNA. I'd be able to find plenty without that. Denmark's records, as I mentioned earlier, hit or miss. It depends. If you were born in America and you're European, would your descendants be American or European? They would be Americans of European descent. That's really how it is. Oh, I absolutely have cousins in Europe. And let me show you how I know that. I've actually connected with some of them. One of the cool things about Ancestry DNA is looking at your DNA matches. I can look at a map. These are all the people that I share DNA with on the map. So check this out. I got 2 that matched in Australia. I've got 3 that matched in the UK. You can see that one of them is in Manchester. Nina, she lives in Wigan in Lancashire. I've got one living down here in Reading in Berkshire. And then I've got one living in London. And these are all relatives of mine. Nice drum. Thank you. Appreciate that. Ancestry showed you had ancestors who fought on both sides in World War I. That's pretty crazy. Jamaican records, I've never really gotten into Caribbean records. Norwegian records are pretty good. I've done some into that. My Welsh roots are not as deep as my wife's. Let me show you something cool. And there's a lot of things I'm trying to answer here real quick. Let me show you something really cool about me and my wife and our ancestry, okay? My wife's maiden name is Watkins, which is Welsh, okay? Watkins is a very Welsh name. Her great-great-grandfather's name was Watkins. Irish records are tricky because there was a fire that destroyed a lot of the Irish records. Being related to famous people, it's really just a matter of getting back far enough. So here's what's cool about this. The Watkins family, okay? So they go back to a place where they actually lived for a time. Let me show you on the map. Because this is one of the coolest things I've ever found in my research. Her Watkins family, my wife's family, came from this place called Blaena in Wales, right here. Okay? So there you have that. Now, Wales is a very mountainous, kind of hilly region. You see this kind of big mountain right here, right? Okay, now, let me show you my family tree for a second. And I want to show you one of my ancestors. His name was James Croft. And James was born in Ebbw in Wales, which is right there. So my wife's ancestors and my ancestors grew up in towns separated by a hill. That's one of those really cool things when you discover it, you're like, holy cow, that cannot even be real. That here we are, we meet in the year 1999 in Ohio. And 150 years ago, our ancestors came from 2 towns separated by a hill less than a mile away from each other. It gets crazier than that because I come to find out, X-ray, thank you. Your ancestor was a Panzer commander in World War II under Rommel. That is very, very cool. I hope you've done some digging into that. My grandmother, the tree we looked at, the Whitaker family tree, right? My grandmother, her family comes from Tipton, right? But another branch of that family comes from West Bromwich, right here, okay? So I know that they actually went to a church called the Church of All Saints in West Bromwich. So that's this church right here. I started digging on my grandpa's family tree. Okay, my grandparents met in the 1950s here in Ohio. I come to find out that my grandfather had a great-grandmother that was baptized in this church. So my grandparents meet in Ohio in the 1950s. In the 1840s, their great-grandparents were baptized in the same church in England. That's just one of those cool little things that you find out, and you find how we're all interconnected like that. So I just always found that kind of stuff was fascinating. I want to show you one last one, and then I'll get to some more of your questions. This was probably the most ridiculous thing I ever found in my family tree. Okay, so as I mentioned, both of my parents, my mother and father, have roots in eastern Kentucky. That's not unusual here where I live because in Niles, Ohio, where three of my four grandparents grew up, there was a brickyard called Niles Fire Brick. And in the 1930s, hundreds of workers from Olive Hill, Kentucky, this little town in Kentucky, came to Niles, Ohio to work in the brickyard. And so both my mother and father had ancestors who came to Northeast Ohio to work in that brickyard. So it's not unusual that both sides of my family tree come from the same part of Kentucky. Kentucky was by and large settled by Scotch, Irish, and English ancestors who came from Virginia and North Carolina. Now, this is where it gets crazy, because in my family tree, after doing lots and lots of research, I discovered this guy, my sixth great-grandfather. His name was William Thomas Riddle. William Thomas Riddle was a loyalist captain of loyalist militia. So he was born in Virginia, lived in North Carolina, but fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War, as many people did. Fully a third of colonists were loyalists during the American Revolution. He gets captured in May of 1781 by a group of patriot militia. These are fellow North Carolinians who are fighting for the patriot cause. So this is a civil war. These are people from the same town fighting on opposite sides in the Revolutionary War. People who had known each other all their lives. My sixth great-grandfather was captured and hanged at Wilkesboro, North Carolina, at a place called the Mulberry Fields Meeting House. He was hanged from this tree right here, which no longer stands. I've actually been there. I have a piece of the tree. The tree was blown down in a storm a number of years ago. They've cut it up and they sell it for souvenirs. And so I bought a piece of the tree. This is my mother's fifth great-grandfather. A couple years ago, I was doing research on my father's side of the tree, of the family tree. And I stumbled upon this guy, Benjamin Greer. Benjamin Greer is my seventh great-grandfather on my father's side of the family. Now, Benjamin Greer was in the Patriot Militia in North Carolina. Benjamin Greer was in command of the company that captured William Thomas Riddle. My father's sixth great-grandfather captured my mother's fifth great-grandfather, which led to his hanging. That is the craziness that is our family trees. Yeah, so Nate, there's a good chance that our ancestors knew each other. Do I know any of the Riddle family moved west? They absolutely did. So Yeah, a lot of those riddles might have gone back to William Thomas Riddle. So yeah, and here's what's cool about Benjamin Greer. His wife, who's my ancestor, somebody asked about famous relatives. So his wife, Nancy Wilcoxon, her mother's name was Sarah Boone. Sarah was the sister of Daniel Boone. So Daniel Boone's my uncle. Now I'll show you one more famous, and a couple more of my famous interests. And if you research long enough and dig long enough, you can find some of this stuff, which is really, really fun to do. Let me see if I can find one for you, because I've got 3 different lines back to this same person. Here we go. I think this is one of the lines here. No, might be here. Take me a little bit of digging to remember where this is. Baker. Here we go. All right. So Elijah Baker is one of my ancestors from Wilkes County, North Carolina. His father's name was Reverend Andrew Baker, and he was a chaplain during the Revolutionary War. His mother's name was Mary Bowling. Mary was the daughter of a guy named John Bowling, and you can see there's a picture of him, and there's a reason for that. John Bowling is a pretty famous guy. And here he is right here, Major John Bowling, John Fairfax Bowling specifically. So now we're getting into people that are actually known in history. So this guy here is my 8th great-grandfather. And the reason that this matters is that if you go back a little further in John Bowling's family tree, maybe, let's see here. Oh, it's over here, that's why. You find out that his grandmother was a girl named Jane Rolfe. Jane Rolfe's father is a guy named Thomas Rolfe. And Thomas Rolfe's mother was a girl named Pocahontas. So Pocahontas is my ancestor on multiple lines. In fact, I descend from Pocahontas through 3 of my 4 grandparents. So both my mother and father are descended from Pocahontas, which is pretty cool. Because my kids can say that they're descended from a Disney princess, which is pretty awesome. So that's one of my famous ancestors. I've got a few others as well. I'll show you one more, and when it gets really fun is when you can start diving into things like nobility. Cryptic Panda, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Hey, Mate Ambrose, thank you for joining us. Let me show you here Jemima Friend, who's one of my ancestors. She's got a really fascinating story as well. Let me see if I can find. Here we go. Thomas Blossom is my 11th great-grandfather. The reason I'm sharing these stories is not to brag about my family. I'm showing you that this is how you can find, this is the stuff you can find when you do this research and your personal connections. I found out that Thomas Blossom was educated at Cambridge. He was a deacon in the Pilgrim Church in Leyden, Holland. Leyden, insane, or somebody else from Holland, am I pronouncing that correctly? Is it Leyden? I'm not sure. That's where the Pilgrims went, the separatists, before they came to America on the Mayflower. There were actually 2 ships. There was the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Well, the Speedwell kept springing a leak and had to turn back. And they loaded as many of the passengers from the Speedwell onto the Mayflower, which is why the Mayflower was overcrowded. The people who couldn't fit on the Mayflower went back, and Thomas Blossom was one of the people who went back on the Speedwell. He came over years later, and he is my 11th great-grandfather. Now, Thomas Blossom is my connection to a number of famous people. Thomas Blossom is the 9th great-grandfather of President George Herbert Walker Bush. He's also an ancestor of Barack Obama, and he's also the 5th great-grandfather of Wild Bill Hickok, which means that all 3 of those people are my cousins through Thomas Blossom. The EI is not a natural vocal thingy. Yeah, that's probably why I have a hard time with it. Yeah, sorry, Ambrose, I had a hard time with that. Nate Carlos, you're descended from Powhatan. Very cool. So we're cousins, distantly. So anyway, let me go back for a minute. So that, so now I'm researching all about the Pilgrims because Thomas Blossom knew all those people. There's actually a letter still in existence today that Thomas Blossom wrote to Governor Bradford in Plymouth Colony. Now I want to show you one more on this line that's really, really cool. And I'm trying to remember where that line goes through. Here we go. So it's right here. Mary Need is her name. Now, through her family tree, you get to this guy here, Thomas Melford Gentleman, is how he's listed. He's from Nottinghamshire in England, 1524. Why he matters is because of who his mother was. Anne Clifford of Skipton in Yorkshire. Now, if you're from the UK, especially that part of UK, you're going to understand why you get excited when you see the name Clifford from Skipton. Because now you go back a little further in this line, and you're getting to some really interesting people. Because the Cliffords, there's Sir John the Butcher. Some of you have heard me talk about my 16th great-grandfather, who killed Richard III's brother at the Battle of Wakefield, and then died at the precursor to the Battle of Towton at a place called Ferrybridge, Baron Clifford. Now his, I think, grandfather, okay, so his father, now this is what's really cool. Now I'm connected to all kinds of fun, because John the Butcher Clifford dies during the Wars of the Roses at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle in the history of Britain. His father, Thomas Clifford, died at the First Battle of St. Albans during the Wars of the Roses. Now, Thomas Clifford's father... Now, let me go back for a second, because I want to show the whole tree here. Clifford the Big Red Dog. Now, Thomas Clifford's father died at the Siege of Meaux, which is, I think that's how it's pronounced, fighting under Henry V during the 100 Years' War. You go back a little further, and you're going to find that on that same line, I've got an ancestor, Sir Robert Clifford, who was killed at the Battle of Bannockburn, fighting against Robert the Bruce in 1314. That same line, then, Baron Clifford, his grandfather is Henry Hotspur Percy, who died at Shrewsbury in Shropshire, fighting a rebellion against Henry IV, and he is the namesake of Tottenham Hotspur, the English football club. So that just shows you, a whole world that can open up to you. And of course, then through the Cliffords, then I'm also descended from people like Henry III, the King of England, which means I'm descended from King John of England. On this line over here, you've got Edward III, the King of England, that I descend from, which means I descend from Philip IV of France, the kings of Castile. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that you get into when you get back that far on that stuff. Yeah, so part of me thinks I probably should have I should be a Spurs fan, because, I mean, legit, I've got an ancestor that's got a major English soccer club named after him. How am I not rooting for those people? I chose West Brom because I thought it would be cooler to root for somebody small who came from a town that my family came from. So that's kind of why I decided to go with that. Do I have a claim on the throne? Not a chance. I'll show you my closest royal link. And it's right here. This is the closest ancestor of mine who was royal. My 15th great-grandfather, King James IV of Scotland, who died at the Battle of Flodden Field, fighting against the troops under his command of his brother-in-law's wife, Catherine of Aragon, on behalf of his brother-in-law, Henry VIII. But I descend from James IV through one of his many mistresses, a woman named Marion Boyd, through his daughter Catherine, who married a guy named James Douglas. And Zach, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. James Douglas actually at one time was the heir to the throne of Scotland. So I did have that kind of going for me there. And you can see his father, I think, also died at the Battle of Flodden Field. So those are the Douglases of Scotland, which, is a pretty big deal when you understand Scottish history. That's your A-level history exam this week. Very cool. They say that James IV, my ancestor, is buried in London, and they think they even know what building he's buried under. It's some commercial building now. But Zach, you've set the standard. Now Insane's like, oh man, what do I do? Yeah, I'm like 20 millionth in line. That's probably about right. Like a third of us are probably descended from royalty, at least. I'll show you one more really cool ancestor. This one's on my wife's side. He's a legit Catholic saint. So this is my wife's ancestor, Thomas More. She descends through his son, John. So that's part of her family tree. Thomas More was beheaded at the Tower of London on orders of Henry VIII because he wouldn't sign an act acknowledging Henry as head of the Church of England. How much does it cost? I think you can get an Ancestry membership for like $20 a month. That's the easiest and cheapest way to get started if you want to do it yourself. Yeah, Richard III was found under a parking lot. How far back can you trace your ancestry? Well, once you get back to a certain point, everything is pretty speculative. But I do like to brag about this particular line that I claim is legit. Lauren, thank you. So I'm a prince? No, unfortunately, no. I do have a couple of lines back to this guy here. If I spell it right, got to start with that. So there's my 38th great-grandfather, Charlemagne. And I would say I wouldn't be surprised if half of people of European descent can trace at least one line back to Charlemagne. Zandivo, I charge $200 for 10 hours of research, but I've got about 30 people that have reached out to me and at least asked about it. So I've got a bit of a waiting list right now because I've already started doing research for a couple of people, and I'm going to try to get to more. So right now I'm not taking anybody else, unfortunately. Is there an affiliate link for Ancestry? No, unfortunately, I'm not aware of Ancestry doing anything like that. But if you do want to support me, there are other ways to do that. There's links in the description to go back to that. Genghis Khan, I don't think I have. But here's another cool ancestor that I have. And I don't know if he's even going to show up in here. But I do have a couple of... If you can trace yourself back to Spanish nobility, there's a good chance you can trace your ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad. So that's pretty cool to be able to say that. Charlemagne's your 41st great-grandmother. I hope you meant grandfather, unless Charlemagne is identifying as a woman and I wasn't aware of that. How much research can I do in 10 hours? All right, let me show you a family tree I did. Here you go. This was 10 hours of research on a family tree that I did. And this was difficult. I can usually find more than this because almost all of this was in Europe and specifically in Poland. This is almost all Polish roots right here. And you can see all the people that I found in this family tree in 10 hours. And a lot of these, it's not just finding names, it's also finding information about them. Like I found on this line, I was able to find some information. Like I found out that his third great-grandmother had a son who was killed on the next to last day of World War I. I actually mentioned him in a video, Harry Bowers, killed on November 10th, 1918. So there's a lot of stuff like that I was able to find. Maltese family, interesting. Insane, thank you, sir. Asserting dominance. Regular programming has resumed. Thank you so much. Insane, I got to tell you, I'm feeling a little intimidated about the possibility of meeting you. I know we've talked about when I come to Europe to do videos for the channel that I wanted to meet you and hang out with you and do some videos together. But now that I know that you're like 6'5", I don't know how I feel about it, because you're like a half a foot taller than me, and that's just not okay. You know what I mean? Asian roots are much more difficult, yes. I'm going to have to wrap this up. My wife's been away for the last 4 days, and I think she's home. So I'm going to wrap this up so I can go see her. But we're going to do this again. I'm going to do more of these types of things and show you tips and tricks and help you with research. We might even have you guys throw out some information on your family tree, and maybe I'll do maybe as a giveaway. In fact, that's a fantastic idea. I'll do a giveaway, and we'll set that up and maybe announce that soon. And what I'll do is I'll actually research, if you're okay with it, I'll research your family tree on a live stream, and we'll dig into it. It might be kind of fun to do that. And it's a great way to show you in real time what it looks like to research a family tree, and dig in and hopefully give you some more tidbits on that. Yes, African ancestry is going to be very difficult. History Explained, appreciate that. Kings and Generals is coming. I'm going to do more Kings and Generals stuff. Their stuff is fantastic. It's one of my favorite channels on YouTube. So thank you guys. Make sure you subscribe if you're new. If you have a pedigree back to the 14th century, probably not a lot more I can help for you. I do have ancestors from Sweden. But we'll see you next time, guys. Thank you so much.